Well, today's sermon is probably the one sermon in this series that I was most anticipating and the most trepid to preach. Today's topic is both relevant and present in our current society. And as a nation, we are at a struggling point, wrestling over how to address the many layered intricacies of racism, prejudice, and intolerance. The lines have been drawn with many people having the mentality of you're either with us 100% or you're against us 100%. And we can't even as a society come together to agree on the definition of words so that at times when we're having discussions, it's like we're talking two different languages. And how do you have a discussion when you're not even talking the same language? And honestly, church, I would need more than just this one sermon to get into everything I would love to get into with this topic. So if at times it seems like I'm rushing over parts or not totally explaining myself, it's probably because we just do not have all the necessary time. If after this sermon you think it would be beneficial for us to have further discussions on this topic, let me know, and we can set something up and possibly even bring in other godly people into our discussion to help us to continue this discussion. I'm going to apologize up front to Michelle because I'm not even sure where I'm going with the sermon right now. I have an outline. I'm not sure if I'm going to get to all of the outline or which ways I'm going to be going with the outline. I'm just letting you know I have prayed and prayed and prayed over this sermon. And the sermon keeps changing. So I'm just going to let God lead, and I'm going to follow. If you haven't guessed, today's topic is on racism. But the big question that I'm going to try to answer for us today is, what is the church? What are we supposed to do? What is the Christian response to racism? Now, I can sum this all up into one sentence and be done with it. We are to love everyone, period. And yet, this has been said over and over and over and over from pulpit to pulpit to pulpit. And sometimes I still don't think we understand what God means when He tells us we are to love all people. And if I'm honest, there are times I think I still struggle with that. I want to get one thing straight right out of the gate here. This sermon is not going to directly address the myriad of issues that our nation is currently experiencing. I am not going to speak on the current events that are happening right in our midst today. And most of that is because I do not believe there is any policy or legislation or protest or riot or governmental or social solution to these issues. The only solution to a moral issue is a moral, biblical solution. Because the core of racism is hatred. And hatred You cannot regulate or force someone to change their heart beliefs. No matter, there has never been a law that can change what I believe. You can shut me up with a law, but that law will not change how someone believes. The church in America has tried this over and over and over again to regulate morality, and it just doesn't work. And our biggest problem in America is the church has failed. See, because if the church would do what God calls us to do, we wouldn't need any governmental rules or laws or legislations to try to fill the void in which we see ourselves. If the church, and by the church, I mean the people of the church, would follow God's command of taking care of the poor and the orphaned and the widowed, the government would not have needed to step in and provide housing or Social Security or any of the other governmental benefits we now have. Do you hear me? If the church would have stepped up and followed God's command to care for all people, we would not have to have the government regulate us or try to regulate our moral lives. Our very denomination was founded on speaking out for the marginalized and the oppressed. We were on the forefront of not only calling out slavery as wrong, but doing something about it. Many of our churches on the East Coast were part of the Underground Railroad. Our denomination was also at the forefront of recognizing that women are as equal as men and deserve the same rights as men. A church up in New York was where the first women's meeting was held, and it was a Wesleyan church. And then something happened. I don't know what really happened, but we got complacent. We started to care more about our appearance of being holy than being holy. Because holiness is love. And what the Wesleyan Church ended up starting to do, we started making all these rules. And the rules became more important than the actions. We failed our society. This is one of the reasons why I'm so happy for our denominational leaders now, as they're stepping up and they're calling us out and they're bringing us back to our foundation of God-loving people. Jesus is our example, and he did not care about rules. Many people would say Jesus was a rule breaker. He cared more about meeting people where they are and loving them than about whether he was breaking some rule that the church had set up. Somewhere along the line, we have lost that. And we have failed. Our only path forward as a church universal is to go back to where we got it wrong. So as we begin to dig into our churches or this Christian response to racism, I think it is essential to set up two things first. First, I'm going to set up some foundational Christian understandings that we need to agree on. The foundation. Because if you have to have a firm foundation before you can build anything. And this goes without saying, but the foundation we're going to build on is Christ. He's the base. And then we're going to build our foundation. Because without Christ, it doesn't matter your foundation. It's going to be weak. And then the second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the definition of racism for us today on what I'm talking about racism. Because currently in our culture, there are several different definitions of racism. So we need to know what I'm talking about so that way we can go forward. You might not agree with my definition of racism, but at least we have a starting point of where we can talk about this. So the first foundational understanding is we are all created by God from one man. I think we can agree to this. We know it's recorded in Genesis that God created all of humanity from one man, Adam. God breathed life into this man. And from all of humanity has been born from this man. And if I may, I don't know what you think about this, but I hate to break it to you if you think Adam was white. He wasn't. He would be more of an olive color, like the Middle Easterners. Just like Jesus is not white. Jesus was an olive-colored person. Sure, many of our churches are adorned with Jesus as being white. That's bad on our part. I'll call that one out. I've never really liked that. Jesus' color was an olive tone. Seem to have lost my place. We are all created by God. The second thing is, the second foundation is we are all made in God's image. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, God states, "Let us make man in our image." This statement alone should make all life precious, regardless of color or anything. All life should be precious from cradle to grave because we are all created in God's image. We are all sacred. But not only that, we are all one family. And I just realized I didn't read our core verse today. And how I realized that, I see Acts 17, verse 26. So let me read Acts 17, verse 26 for you. From one man he made all nations that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. We are all created from one man. And we are all part of the same family. How else? No matter where we trace our lineage, we're all going to come back to the same point of Adam and Eve. The only difference between me and my brother-in-law, Jeff, is the amount of melanin in our body. My brother-in-law, Jeff, is an African American. Pretty dark-skinned, if he doesn't mind me saying so. But I'll get ragged for this later, so don't worry. But the only difference between us is the amount of melanin that is in our skin. Melanin is that thing that determines the color of your skin, of your hair. That's the only difference. And the last foundation is that we are all loved equally by God. John 3:16, God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whosoever believes in him, whosoever. I have said this before, but if you were the only person on this earth, God still would have sent his Son to die on the cross for your sins. He loves you that much. He loves each one of us that much. And it's the same love. His love is not prejudiced. He has no favorites, except for that everyone is his favorite. With these foundational truths that I think we can all agree on, I think you can see where I'm headed with this sermon. First, before we get there, or as we get there, I want to define racism. And for me, for what we're talking today, racism is attributing to one race intrinsic superiority or valuing it above one another, and then treating others as undesirable or evil. Racism is about making quick judgments on the characteristics of a race to rate them as either inferior or superior, and in such demonstrating partiality or bias. I think that wraps up the core of what racism is. That we're judging people based off of the color of their skin, off of their ethnic background, of some external trait, and determining from that whether they are better or worse than us. I will state right here, right now, right in the beginning, if you hear nothing else, hear this. Racism is a sin. Period. In any form. There is absolutely no reason to hate or judge a person or a group of people for no other reason than based off the color of their skin. I will go one step further and say there is no reason for anyone to harbor any hate in their heart for anyone for any reason. And yet, throughout all of history, mankind has done this exact thing. We could go back to almost the beginning of time. But just in recent history, we have experienced the most horrible forms of racism. Whether you begin to examine the over 1 million deaths of Armenians in the Armenian genocide in Turkey, or the millions of deaths in the Holocaust, or the massacres in Rwanda, the genocide taking place currently in the Sudan, The Japanese slaughter of 6 million Chinese, Indonesians, Koreans, Filipinos, Indo-Chinese, or the horrors of the slave trade of the 17th and 18th century. Our history as mankind is full of blood and unspeakable horrors, all in the name of ethnicity or race superiority. And it is wrong, and it is a sin. Racism, at its core, is favoritism. And as was stated in our foundational understandings, God does not play favorites. Even when he chose the Israelites to bring the good news, it wasn't because of anything they did or how much better they were than anyone else. It was just because that was his plan to use them. He graced them. He gifted them to be his vehicle to bring his love to all people. The second thing I want to bring out to us is that racism comes from a fractured world view. Am I going right? All right. My notes are all messed up today, so I'm piecing this together as I go along. Racism comes from a fractured worldview instead of a godly worldview. Racism divides us. Just look at how we are across the world. How many different countries do we have around the world? How many different dialects in these countries do we have? We have mankind has separated ourselves based off of where we live, how we look, in a myriad of different reasons. We have set up walls and boundaries so that we don't cross each other. This was never God's plan, ever. Yes, God wanted us to live all over the world. In Genesis, he said, go and spread all over the place. But he never wanted us to be separate. He wanted us to do it all in unity, in relationship with him. It was not until sin entered the world that all this became crazy. And whether we want to admit it or not, each of us believe we are better than other people. Isn't this why we're patriotic? I'm one of the most patriotic people I know. I love America. But we love America because we believe America is the best country to live in, and that we are better than the rest of the world. And we'll fight to defend that. But doesn't every other person in the world believe that about their country? And with America, here's where I'm getting at with racism. We look at other countries, people from other countries, and we distrust them. We automatically distrust them because they come from the Arab world. It's because we have fractured ourselves off and don't see the godly worldview that we are all just wonderfully made by God himself. The third thing I want to say is racism is learned. As Nelson Mandela stated, no one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. one that I'm proud of. At one point in my life, I was a racist. I had my reasons. None of them particularly good, but they were reasons. But I just want to give you a little glimpse into why, at what time I was a racist. First, as a very young child, I grew up very sheltered. I grew up the early part of my life in all white neighborhoods. And at that time, there were many adults in my life that would say disparaging, often racist things about other cultures and races, especially the black community. Now, I grew up the first 6, 7, 8 years of my life in that culture. And then in my 4th grade year, my dad got a pastorate in a town in South Jersey. Totally different than what I was used to. And on my first day of school, I walked into a classroom, looked around, and saw all these different colors of people sitting in the same room. And I was just so curious. Because you have to see, prior to this, the only time I saw anyone of color was either on a TV or out my window as we were driving by in a car. I couldn't help myself. I just stared and stared. Just stared. The culture was so different that I didn't even know how to act or what to say. I had a very thick Pennsylvania Dutch accent compared to a Southern Jersey drawl. Well, needless to say, I believe some people took offense to me staring or something I said, because for at least the next solid month, and it was probably longer, every day after school, I was chased home by a group of kids calling me all sorts of names. And whenever they caught me, they would beat me up senseless. I remember being scared and not understanding why. And for a while, I refused to go to school because I was so scared. But it didn't stop there in that first couple months. Through the entire time I lived in New Jersey, I was picked on, ganged up on, and humiliated day after day after day. I had many, many awful, bad memories from that time. These experiences were part of me learning to hate people based on their skin color and nothing else. I was learning not to trust. And I used these experiences to prejudge any person of color I met. And I started hanging out with people who felt the same way, and we just fed into each other. Hear me. I am not saying this was right of me. I'm not trying to provide you with justification on why I was a racist, or even to justify any of my actions. But I tell you this to illustrate that racism is learned. No one is born a racist. We have to learn to hate each other. And this is why I love the ending of Mandela's quote. Because through the years and because of the transformational power of Christ, I have learned to love all people instead of hating them. My heart breaks for the years that I hated people based off of nothing else than my own prejudices. I have learned to apply Martin Luther King's criteria to people today, to look at their character instead of looking at the color of their skin. And with that said, I am not blinded because racism continues to exist. Racism hasn't stopped. Some of us might not want to admit it here today, but racism is alive and well in America. Just look around, watch the news. It is evident. Every color of every race has its biases and hatred towards other cultures and races. And that is what racism is all about. Hatred. Church, until we face the root of racism, it will always exist. There is no law, legislation, anything that will change until we face hatred. And any form of hatred is wrong. Hate is a moral issue, not a political one or a social issue. It manifests in our social political arenas, but it's not their issue. The only way to root out hate is with love. Where do we start? What is the Christian response? It starts with you and me. We start with transforming our own heart. And we're going to look at heart today. I told you this is a little bit longer, and I apologize. We begin with being honest with ourselves. And I mean honest with ourselves. And being honest with ourselves is probably the hardest thing for us to do, honestly. As a matter of fact, we will lie more to ourselves than to anyone else just so that we don't have to be honest with ourselves. We don't really want to look at ourselves. And the best place to start being honest with ourselves is by praying the prayer of David, which is found in Psalm 139:23. David prays this: "Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's any offensive way in me, and lead me into the way everlasting." That's hard. And then allow God to show you your heart. No matter how painful or hard that is. Then, once we start to become honest with ourselves, we need to evaluate our heart. We need to be introspective to see where we stand with racism and hatred. Some questions we need to ask ourselves and be honest with ourselves. Or do we judge people by the color of their skin, or how they talk, or how much they make? Do we, when we're walking down the street and we see a black person coming in front of us, do we go? Or when we're walking down the street and we see a group of bikers parked at the restaurant we were going to go in, do we not go into that restaurant because we're afraid of the bikers? While that's not racism, that's a form of prejudging people based off of their outside appearance. And that's wrong. Because I'm telling you, there's a lot of people that look like bikers, that dress like bikers, and they're the most awesome people you can ever meet. I still remember when we had camp over on Sealands Grove, and the first time the Christian Biker Association pulled in, and the faces that I saw on the people in the campground made me laugh, because they were just like, they didn't know what to do. They thought the Hell's Angels were coming onto the campground. But what I'm saying, we need to ask these questions. Do we get scared or angry or insecure when we approach people different than us? Do we make inappropriate jokes based on skin color or ethnicity? I know I do, because I pick on the Polak over here all the time. But I do it out of love, and he knows that. But do we do that with scorn in our heart? Or maybe just a little bit of hatred? Do we have any form of hate in our heart for anybody? See, because if we even have a little bit of hate in our heart, it can quite quickly grow and lead to other forms of hate. So what we need to do as we're evaluating our heart is we need to root out all forms of hate and be honest with ourselves and see these forms of hate. And after we evaluate our heart, we need to act to change our heart. See, once we identify our shortcomings, identifying our shortcomings is good, but if we do nothing with it, it's useless. But once we identify them, and identify where we may or may not have racist tendencies or biases or whatever you want to call it in today's society, we must begin that process of transforming into love. Luckily, as Christians, we don't have to try to do this alone. We have an advocate living inside of us who is actively working to transform our hearts as well as we work on it ourselves. See, when the Holy Spirit shines areas on where we hate or where we are prejudiced, we should immediately confess it to God and ask Him to purify us and pray that He helps us to transform. We must turn from our hate and instead love. As I was recently discussing with my daughter, love is more of an action than a feeling. Love is a choice we make every day. And just like love, hate is a choice we make every day. Let's choose love and not hate. Once we begin to act on and begin to allow God to transform our hearts, this is when we can begin to reach out to others. See, we have to do the hard work first. We have to search ourselves first. Then, once we search our hearts, and our hearts are full of love for everyone, we can begin to help others transform their hearts as well. The Scripture says, as iron sharpens iron, so does one man sharpen another. We help each other grow in love. But if we are not careful, that's a double-edged sword. Because if we're not careful, we can also help each other grow in hate. This is why it's so important to start the process of transforming our hearts before we try to help someone else. Because we could inadvertently or advertently, that's the way you would say that, cause people to be racist and hate others. We need to let God lead the way. Also, a major part of reaching is standing up for those who do not have a voice, for those who are defenseless, for those who are being oppressed, for the poor, for the destitute. We need to show mercy by standing up for any form and all injustices from the cradle to the grave. The church needs to stand up and not only proclaim love, but stand up in the name of love. We need to call out injustice. As Christ exampled and teaches us, no greater love has a man for another than when he willingly sacrifices his life for him. And lastly, we need to remain teachable. Because we need to do this introspective a lot in order to root out all the ugliness that could be in our hearts. And I have said this with the Christian walk, that the Christian walk is like peeling an onion. God peels us. God doesn't take a knife and cut straight to the heart. What God does is he takes peels of the onion of our lives and he goes, okay, you're ready to work on this today. You're ready to work on your selfishness. And he peels that part. And when he gets done, when you're no longer selfish, he puts that away. And then the next thing you know, he starts peeling the next layer. And then the next layer. And the next layer. That's what sanctification is all about. Allowing God to peel these layers. Because there's times in our lives when we're not ready to face what we need to face. God knows this. And he loves us. And he's willing to be patient with us. So just because I think I got it all together today might not mean tomorrow God shows me areas in my life where I'm still struggling with racism, intolerance, and hatred. And the same with your life. We need to always be willing to listen to others as well as God. As hard as it is, we have to be willing to listen to the other people, even when we don't agree with what they're saying, because there might be some truth in what they're saying that we need to hear. In our society today, nobody wants to listen. Everyone wants to speak their truth, but nobody wants to listen to anybody else's truth. If we're all so busy speaking, how are any of us listening? I am learning day by day to listen to others. And I have learned to listen more and more and more. And I'm learning that when I want to speak is when I need to shut up and listen a little bit more. But I'm not only listening with my ears today, I'm listening with my heart. I feel the pain that others are feeling. God is growing in me a heart of compassion that I hope never stops growing. This is what we all need, is the heart of compassion. Whether or not other people are compassionate with us. But in order for him to do that, I needed to become willing to listen to the hard truths and listen to those I normally would not listen to. Listen to those that as soon as they start speaking, I get all prickly and start, no, not going to do it. I'm warning to just shut up and let them speak and process through the Word on what they are saying is good. Because that's our standard is the Word, is it not? Anything anybody tells us, we bring back to the Word. And if it agrees with the Word, whether we like it or not, we have to accept it. There is no quick fix to the issue of racism today. But we need to start somewhere. We need to start with you and me. And one by one, through grace and the power of Jesus Christ, we can transform not only our lives, but the lives of many. And it all starts with love. As we close, I just want us to listen to a song by Thomas Rhett. It's not necessarily a Christian song, but the words are very relevant for today's topic and relevant for our lives. So if you're watching from Facebook, I encourage you to YouTube Thomas Rhett. The song is called Be the Light. And we'll listen to this song here, and then I'll close us. And actually, I think I'm going to close this in prayer first, and then we'll listen to the song, so that way those that are watching can also close in prayer. But the words for this song are impactful, and I encourage you, and encourages us to be the light wherever we are. Let us close in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, I don't know what else to say, Lord. I thank you for sending your Son to die for whosoever believes in you. I thank you for giving me the courage to speak things that I'm quite ashamed of. I thank you for all your words.